This is CB Up for Discussion, a podcast series from Community Business where we tackle DE&I and wellbeing hot topics with special guests from across Asia.
Hi, I'm Janet Ledger. I'm the CEO of Community Business and I'll be your podcast host for this episode. Today, we're delighted to have up for discussion Manisha Wijesinghe, who is the Executive Director of Help for Domestic Workers. Help is a Hong Kong not-for-profit that works to empower migrant domestic workers and give them access to their rights through education, advice, community and employment engagement. Manisha herself is a qualified lawyer with over 14 years of experience in human rights and social impact. Prior to joining Help, she worked with a number of NGOs and social impact organisations across Asia, including UNICEF, Save the Children and Christian Action. At Daly & Associates, she focused on migrant worker rights and international labour law. Manisha was the winner of the Tatler Magazine 2022 inaugural Front and Female Award, the 2023 American Chamber of Commerce 19th Annual Women of Influence Award for championing disadvantaged communities and minorities, and awardee of the 2023 Tatler Gen T list. Manisha, thank you so much for joining us today on Up for Discussion.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. So, first up, Manisha, could you give us an outline of your work with Help?
Sure. I joined Help in 2019 when Help for Domestic Workers was looking at the space surrounding migrant domestic workers and the way in which the organization could respond to the needs of the community. At that point, Help had been in operation for around 30 years, and this was an organization that was very much set up when domestic work, or foreign domestic workers as we call them in Hong Kong, was a very new concept. So the organization was established at a time when there weren't a lot of programs or services that were set up to support this community, and it really came about from a space where this community needed fundamental and basic support. But over the 30 years, obviously, the space had changed, the needs of the community had changed. So that was kind of where I came into the organization to relook at what we as an organization, but more importantly, we as a community could do to make sure migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong were not only supported, but had every opportunity to succeed, just like any other migrant. You know, Hong Kong is such a vibrant place. Many of us are migrants ourselves, coming to better our lives, to contribute to Hong Kong's economy, but also make sure that we're able to contribute to our own families and our own communities. So that was really how I started with Help. And over the past 4 years, it has really been very much a roller coaster journey. I joined Help late 2019, and then by early 2020, we went to COVID. And then that was 3 years of our lives where we were kind of responding to each wave, each new development that was happening with COVID, and then, you know, the impact of that with the community. And I think now in 2024, COVID is almost a bit of a distant memory, but what's important is, I think, underserved communities are still dealing with the whiplash from that. And that's still something that we're trying to respond to and still trying to support the communities through.
So our niche at Community Business is exploring the impact of businesses on their communities, and an area that is often overlooked is the impact of care work, specifically domestic care and the knock-on effect for businesses as employees in our region. Can you speak more on that?
I'm really grateful that Community Business is actually highlighting this as something that is important to the conversation around diversity, inclusion, and equity. Because I think a lot of the times care work is overlooked as part and parcel of this conversation. And I think for us at Help, it just makes complete sense to look at care work as part of DEI conversations. Because I think, you know, when we are trying to push concepts of diversity in the workplace, women in the workplace, you know, people from different backgrounds in the workplace, it's not enough to start from the moment of recruitment. It's not enough to start from the time somebody enters your business, you need to look at the whole ecosystem. What enables these diverse groups of people to enter your workplace? What enables women to be in boardrooms? And if we're not looking at that broader ecosystem, if we're not investing in that broader ecosystem, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. And all we're doing is almost tokenistic interventions to try and address diversity. Particularly in Asia, I think care work is something that is tied very closely with domestic workers or migrant domestic workers. There was a recent ILO study that said around 75 million people are in domestic care work in Asia, with Asia being the employer of around 50%.
Wow.
Globally. So this shows how care work is so closely tied with migrant domestic work. Because in cities like Hong Kong, in cities around Asia, there aren't a lot of structures in place for caregiving. There aren't, caregiving homes or things like that. Or even if they are, they're not very accessible.
Yeah.
So a lot of families have to rely on caregivers, and most of the time that is migrant domestic workers. And the reality is, why is it pertinent to companies? Because I think everyone is going to be a caregiver at some point in their life. Whether you're caring for your parents, whether you're caring for your children, whether you're caring for your siblings, or even your pets, that is going to be a reality in life. And in a city, in a community where there is no formalized structure, migrant domestic workers is something that we need to look at and look at as a serious investment.
Yeah, thank you. And also, here at CV, we believe in the role of businesses as responsible employers. So in Asia, with many people themselves, as you just said, are employers because they're having domestic helpers. So can you explore more the duty of care as an employer and any observations you've got from that angle?
Thank you. Yes, so I think, when you're looking at employers of migrant domestic workers, there is a lot of conversation around migrant domestic workers being part of the family. But I think by saying that, and yes, they're important members of our family, we love them, they are there for our most important milestones, our birthdays, our kids' births, weddings, all of these things. But I think we detract from the conversation when we don't look at them also as employees. Because at the end of the day, while they're important members of our household, they're also employees. And we need to make sure that we are supporting them as employees. And I think that's a conversation that we need to start having. This balancing act that employers of migrant domestic workers have to do. You're having this person living in your house, seeing you when you're most vulnerable, but also they're an employee. You have to follow labor standards. You have to, provide them with equitable pay. You need to make sure that they are supported, whether it's their mental well-being, whether it's their physical well-being, because that then contributes better to your own family. And so in a way, I think there is so much to be thought of, just like you were managing somebody in your own office.
Yeah.
And this is something we always tell, employers who are thinking of hiring domestic workers, or even those who already have domestic workers. Love them, think of them as your auntie, but also don't ignore the fact that you have to do an orientation. When somebody joins, it's like you're having somebody in your office. If they join, you tell them, where's the coffee being kept? Where's the food being kept? What do you do? These are the rules. Those are important parts of setting up this really good relationship. And I think that then lends to employers being able to focus so much more on other important aspects of their life.
Do you think they understand? Do you think most employers understand what the basic rights are, or?
I think there's definitely confusion around it. Again, there was an ILO research that found around 88% of employers either didn't know or were unsure of their rights and responsibilities. And there's a lot that contributes to it. One, again, comes from this idea of aunties, or this idea that they're part of the family. And when somebody's part of the family, you're not thinking about your mother's rights and responsibilities. You're not thinking of your husband's rights and responsibilities. So why would you think of your aunties? So that's where I say it kind of detracts from that conversation. And the second part is obvious. You have unethical employment agencies. You have unethical recruiters who willfully mislead employers and tell them whatever they want to hear in order to get that agency fee, in order to get that business. So there's a lot that contributes to it. But I think as a whole, a lot of employers really do mean well, and there are great employers. It's just the fact that the system is built to be very divisive. This idea that domestic workers are vulnerable and employers are bad, again, really doesn't lend to a good conversation and doesn't lend to actually creating change for this community.
Yeah. So can you speak to any future trends and any shifts that you're seeing that you've witnessed recently?
I think in terms of trends, obviously one of the bigger ones is that domestic work is something that is here to stay. Migrant domestic workers are a community that's here to stay. This is something that Hong Kong has been speaking about, the fact that we do have an elderly population, an aging population, and domestic workers will be filling in that gap. Right now we have around 338,000 domestic workers in Hong Kong, mostly from Philippines or Indonesia. This number is projected by the government to rise to around 600,000. And that is really in response to the aging population. But not only that, you're having small nuclear families. And again, if we want these families to be able to go into work, go into entrepreneurship, all of these things, you need that support at home. Because if you need to focus on the economic development of your family, you need somebody making sure the house is kept well and your children are cared for and your pets are cared for. So again, you're having domestic workers filling in that gap. So that is one big trend that we're seeing, the increasing number of domestic workers. And the other is domestic workers from diverse communities. We are seeing more and more domestic workers coming from countries like Sri Lanka, from India. And these are communities that don't have built-in support networks. Where Filipino domestic workers or Indonesian domestic workers do have established consular presence, do have established community networks. We're seeing domestic workers who come from more South Asian countries not having that. Because they're so small, there's very little investment going into providing them support as well. And then what we at Help see is the workers who do face challenges face extremely difficult challenges. They are exploited far more. They face financial challenges. They face mental health challenges far more than the bigger community because those networks are not in existence. And then I think the third trend that we're seeing is this active engagement with employers. I think we're moving away from that divisive conversation that employers don't care or employers don't want to engage. And for me, that is the best thing ever. Because the reality is this relationship of domestic work versus employer, it's a 50-50 relationship. And if you're not engaging with both parties in that conversation, you're really not making any meaningful headway in that issue. And as part and parcel of that, I think it's also heartening to see more and more companies being aware of the need to invest in care work, whether that is in domestic work in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, or in the broader care economy. Because I think there is this bigger understanding that if you're not investing in this caregiving support, you're not actually investing in your company's employees.
The caregiving is generally something we've explored at Community Business through our recent research, and a topic we feel it continues to need attention, particularly in Asia. From your context at Help, could you please speak more to the nature of care, the gendered element, and the importance of acknowledging the often unseen care?
I think I'll start with your last point, the importance of recognizing unseen care. I think there's so much that goes into caregiving. There is the physical element, there is the mental element, and I think we don't ascribe it enough importance, and we don't realize that it's something that makes households run efficiently, but in turn it allows people who are outside the household not to be worried about what's going on in the household. But unfortunately, because we don't ascribe that much importance to it, caregiving doesn't have that dollar value. And this is something we see even when we speak about domestic work. The monthly payment amount for domestic worker, the salary is, even if there's an annual increase, there's always such a debate about what that increase should be or what is the value of caregiving. But we forget to think, what is the savings when you're having a caregiver at home? a lot of people who are right now in offices, in boardrooms, wouldn't be able to be there if there wasn't caregiving support back home. If not, they're going to have to run out at 12, 1 o'clock to pick up their kid. They're going to have to spend an entire morning going to a hospital with their parent. And we don't ascribe that dollar value. What we ascribe to caregiving is, oh, it is unskilled work, you don't need a university degree to do it. And because of that, we forget how much of time it frees up. Again, I think there was this research that was done which said, women who have caregiving support are 78% more likely to go into the workforce, whereas 49% of women without caregiving go into the workforce. So you can see that disparity, and that then brings me to your second comment on the gendered element of caregiving. I think, again, as we talk about equity within the home, the reality is still women carry an inordinate amount of burden related to caregiving. Even if work is split 50-50 when it comes to the physical element of it, the mental burden, in women's heads they carry who's the name of my kid's doctor, or who's my parents' medication time, where is it, and things like that. And so all of that eats into the ability for women to operate efficiently. I think, yes, there is more and more conversations about equity within the home, but the reality to this day is the fact that caregiving is primarily a woman's responsibility. And we see this a lot even at HELP, when we're talking about migrant domestic workers, it is usually the wife or the mother of the household who is involved in the hiring, in the recruitment, in making sure they find the right domestic worker. Or if the employment relationship breaks down, it's usually the mother who has to give up their job, or the mother who has to take, leave and go and pick up the child, or go to the hospital, or do all of these extra things. So there is still definitely a gendered element. And again, it's again this lack of understanding of the important role played by caregiving. Because we don't think it's important enough, it automatically falls to the person who, almost historically we've ascribed to be responsible for it, or who has the capability to leave work early, or whose role is not as important in the workforce. And I think that again lends to this ongoing lack of investment in DE&I, in making sure that we're allowing both males and females to proceed in the workplace, or people who have traditionally carried on these household roles. And I think it's really interesting how that knock-on effect happens. Historically, women have been ascribed the household roles, and now domestic workers have been brought in to take on those household roles. And it's still ascribed this lesser role than going to office and doing something important, quote unquote.
Do you have any practical recommendations for our listeners, and specific to tackling a couple of angles? So corporates that operate in Asia, as well as tips for individuals themselves.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with for individuals. So I think for individuals, what we always tell employers of domestic workers is to look at the relationship like an employment relationship, especially at the beginning. If you set it up well, that means you're 50% there to success. You're 50% there to a problem-free relationship. Obviously, again, as I said, care for her, she will care for you, she's a member of your family, but also be cognizant that you do need to be mindful of that relationship being an employment relationship. She is in Hong Kong to provide for her family, to possibly educate her children, to build her house. And so make sure that, when you're orienting your domestic worker, when you're speaking to her, set out those ground rules, have an agreement on what you need. The other thing I would say is definitely building check-ins with your domestic worker. I think, again, something that we bring in the corporate space, we have one-on-one check-ins with our staff, with our team members. Why does that not happen back in the home? Again, I think that's really important, especially because, we see mental health challenges is something that is significantly high within the migrant domestic worker community. And that's just because of the way their journey is. These are 98%, many of them, they're women, they're mothers, they've left their families behind. A lot of the domestic workers we meet at HELP, they may have left their kid when they were 6 months old and gets to see them only every 2 years. And they might never see them again until they're 20 for an extended period of time. So they deal with a lot of guilt, a lot of fear of losing touch with their children, of losing those important years of parenting. They deal with the guilt of, families struggling back home while they're in this fabulous city, even if that's not the reality. There's all of these things. So for individuals, what I'd say is, check in with your domestic worker. Make sure that not only is she getting her salary, not only is she getting her food, but she's also getting that psychological support. She's getting that, touch point with you to make sure. Because I think another thing that I'd like to remind is, these domestic workers, they are almost a front line in terms of mental health support for our families. When we're talking about youth mental health crisis, what I'd like to remind is, a lot of these domestic workers, they're the first person your child sees when they're coming home. If they're being bullied at school, if they're struggling at school, your domestic worker is the first person who's responding to that, even before you see your child. So again, investing in the well-being of your domestic worker, the fact that she's psychologically supported means she can psychologically support your child, your parent. Moving on to companies, I think, as I said, what we want companies to do is to think more broadly about their investments in diversity and inclusion. Because, with investing in the care economy, you're really making a meaningful investment in making sure that your company is diverse. Because if not, what you end up happening is people who don't have those care needs, they're the ones who end up being able to perform well in companies, being able to move on into higher positions, being able to move into boardroom positions. And I think especially this is important given that this year, the Hong Kong Exchange wants listed companies to have women in boardrooms. Well, then what allows women in boardrooms? Because I think, as much as we say modern day, there's equity in the household, there is an additional mental burden for women in terms of caregiving, in terms of what has to be done in the house. And if companies are able to meaningfully invest in that and support women with their caregiving needs, then you're going to see more and more women moving up. You're going to see a pipeline of phenomenal young women moving up and actually being able to represent these diverse needs. And I think then finally, it makes sense for companies to invest in this care economy because, as I said, in Asia, there's around 75 million migrant domestic workers. And all of these women and men come from countries in Asia. Every migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong represents an investment in their home country. Represents these people are putting multiple children through school. Sometimes because of their income, they are able to send their first generation of children to university. And so if you're thinking of companies that have an interest in the Asia-Pac region, then you're looking at a double investment. You're investing in Hong Kong, but you're also investing in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in all these countries because you're allowing the next generation to go to university, next generation to enter into schools, enter into businesses, things like that. So I think that's what I would say definitely for businesses is to start looking at DEI much more broader than from the recruitment stage.
So finally, a question that we like to ask all of our guests. At Community Business, we do believe that one small action can cause a ripple of change through society. So what do you think is the biggest way we can make a ripple of change and a positive impact?
I think I'll take that question in two parts. First, for individuals, I think, there is a lot of conversation around raising awareness, which for me is, I think, a bit of a pet peeve. I think we've done a lot in terms of raising awareness. I think now is the time to take action. And, if we're not going to take action, we're going to be raising awareness for the next 20 years and nothing is going to happen. We're not going to move the needle. When it comes to individuals, I think the best thing I can ask you, if you're an employer of a domestic worker, make sure that you're checking in with your domestic worker, providing them that support. Think of them as a member of your team. They're part of your team, making sure your household runs efficiently, just like you would treat one of your team members in your office. and make sure you have those regular check-ins. And if you don't employ a domestic worker, but you know friends who do, and I'm sure everybody in Hong Kong knows somebody who employs a domestic worker, refrain from shaming. I think there's a lot of shame when it comes to employers of domestic workers. If they ask a question about what can I do, or if they don't know something, why are you a bad employer? Why don't you know these things? I think that doesn't lend to anything in terms of making the space better. So if somebody needs that help or needs information, you can reach out to organizations like HELP. We provide support for employers of domestic workers as much as we provide support to domestic workers. So make sure that you link them to services that provide that support. And I think the second part of that is to businesses. Again, one of the things that frustrates me is is that when we do reach out to companies or businesses, there is this party line that says, domestic workers aren't a Hong Kong issue. They're not part of our priorities because we support Hong Kong. But what is more Hong Kong than supporting Hong Kong's houses? And the important fabric of supporting Hong Kong houses is supporting domestic workers, in supporting migrant domestic workers. So I think for businesses, what I would love to say is, when you're doing your DEI initiatives or your ESG or your CSR, any number of letters that you use, think of it from a broader perspective. It shouldn't be limited to the people who are physically in your office. It shouldn't be limited to the moment that you start somebody at recruitment or you get them to the board level. You need to make sure that you're investing in systems that help your employees come into the workplace, that help your employees focus on your company's success or your profits or whatever it is that is important. You need to invest in the ecosystem, because if you're not doing that, all you're doing is patchwork solutions that may sometimes look good on your annual report, but really not moving the needle. So that's what I would say. For individuals, make sure the support is provided to your domestic worker or to your friends who have domestic workers. And for companies, just consider your initiatives from a broader lens and invest in the ecosystem of DEI.
Thank you. And so Manisha, once again, thank you so much for joining us today on this discussion. That was really fantastic. And you've shone a light on a really important topic for Hong Kong. And also I just wanted to thank you for your leadership in terms of driving social inclusion in Hong Kong and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to CB Up for Discussion. For more information about our work across Asia, head to the Community Business website.